Welcome to Discipleship University, First Baptist Dallas. We're going to look at the virtues of the Beatitudes, developing a godly character. My source has been the Bible first and foremost, but we're also going to look at the definitions by Peter Kreeft, who was a scholar at Acton University I studied with on C.S. Lewis. So he wrote a book that's called Back to Virtue, Traditional Moral Wisdom for Modern Moral Confusion. And so in this definition of the Beatitudes, he claims that the Beatitudes are ways of blessedness from the Lord. The Beatitude is defined as a beatific vision. That's where we get this sense of seeing the vision of God, hearing His word. And so it's an objective state. It's not a subjective feeling. It's a permanent state. That is, it is consistent with God's character and a way of revelation of God's character to us as a permanent way of existence for eternity. So we depend on God's grace to give us this gift of this vision and our will to turn toward Him and to His will, not chance or fate. And we see this development in history because the Greeks believed in beatific vision, but they didn't believe in a choice, a freedom of will to turn toward Christ and know God. And so we see there's a sense of joyfulness in this acceptance of these virtues of the Beatitudes. But it's not human happiness that is being emphasized. It's paradoxical, again, or opposite to the vices. And that's why we sometimes call the Beatitudes the virtues of a Christian. And so Kreeft defines this as the greatest good, the summum bonum of all things. So there are 7 virtues, and their contraries or juxtapositions are the sins, the vices, sometimes called the vices. And so we see that for every vice that we have as a human being, every way that we are a falling sinner, we have this virtue that can overcome that if we only turn to Christ. And so he lists those as pride, and that's overcome by the humility of the poverty of spirit. We see avarice and greed, that's overcome by mercy. We see envy. We see that sense of greed that's related so much to envy, jealousy. He sees that we need to, again, have that kind of mourning about our soul. We have to understand that it's the depravity of the soul that is making us want something, desire something beyond what God can give us. And so there's also wrath and sloth. Sloth is a sense of meekness and peacemaking. That's different from this idea of wrath, that we have to have anger. And lust gives us a sense of not having a pure life. So he relates this to the purity of heart. And gluttony is when we are filled up, not just with food, but with ourselves, with pride. And so we have this sense of the virtue of having the idea that we're persecuted for our wants and our needs, but not for the sake of Christ, because that is the sense of persecution we have to have. Only we are persecuted in His name. And so these are the combinations of the virtues opposed to the vices. So we see this all through history and the spiritual history of the cardinal nature of mankind, of the natural man, and the theological spiritual virtues that overcome those. He writes another book called Back to Virtues, the Traditional Moral Wisdom from Modern Moral Confusion. And you all would agree that we have moral modern confusion today. So if we look at this in history, we see that God reads our hearts while we are reading appearances. History is His story. That is, He created history. We can then seek it and learn from it. But God's story, His story, is the greatest story ever told. In other words, in our world today, we have too many people telling my story is how we should follow. And so it's God's story that we should follow, His plan for us. And this road, that's journey that we take, leads from original sin to heaven. The natural virtues, as I said, cannot save our souls. Such virtues like believing in justice, human justice, and puffed up knowledge of wisdom, courage, moderation. Those things can help, but they don't save our souls. They don't help in order to achieve your salvation. They can help to save civilization and make it a better place to restore it back to Christ, but it doesn't give us this sense of revelatory experience. The theological virtues then are faith, hope, and charity that leads the pilgrim in Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan to paradise. Dante has a similar journey of Virgil guiding us through the pits of Inferno to paradise. And so the Beatitudes and the blessedness all flow from the supernatural theological virtues. And so we have to always put on the mind of Christ and look at those things above. So we see this developing during spiritual history. Man is the myth maker. As C.S. Lewis says, Christianity is the only myth that was made real, that was made true. And we are the poets of the pagan imagination. And so we have to have, instead of the pagan imagination, the imago Dei, the image of God, the revelation of His will. And so we see that in early spiritual history, people turn to pagan idols. They turn to pagan ideas of following gods. But here in the dawn of self-consciousness, the axial period, there was an Asian consciousness and also a Western consciousness. There was what we call the Great Divide, the sense of we can do everything through our mind, human mind, the consciousness, whether it's meditation in the Oriental Asian consciousness or with logic and rationality in the Western consciousness. Then along come the Hebrews. The Hebraism in spiritual history gave us a new virtue in practice. The Jewish prophets emphasized the conscience, the word of ethics, virtue, with the thinking not only of the mind, of the rational mind, but as a man thinks in his heart, so he is. And so we have this heartfelt wisdom. And then the Greeks gave us Hellenism, and that is very, very philosophical, theoretical virtue. The Greek philosophers developed a sense of ethics or virtues with reasoning, of rationality. So when we get to the Middle Ages, we started developing a much more Christian synthesis between the Neoplatonic ideas of rationalism and using the mind and reasoning, with Christianity, this heart Hebraic idea. And so the Renaissance then helped us to return to Hellenism with the Neoplatonic movement, and we had a rebirth of learning. Reformation gave us, though, a real turn and a return to Hebraic ideas of the Bible. Classical modernity, though, gave us all the enemies, in the sense of pure Christianity, or what C.S. Lewis calls mere Christianity. That is, the Enlightenment gave us an ultra-rationalism, what we see as sort of a higher criticism, and Hellenism was secularized so that we could have this sense of understanding that we can, again, figure out what God planned in His world, in His plan for us. And so anti-modernity arose from this in the 19th century. After the 18th century of Enlightenment, we had romantic ideas of irrationalism. The pendulum swung the other way, where we just believed that we could become emotional creatures with the heart alone, inspirational creatures, where Hebraic secularization took place. And that brings us to our postmodern times, the contemporary times of what I call the postmodern period, the present of a new axial period. We're on a turning point again, where we have to find out that the true idea is based on the fundamentals of Christianity. And so we go back to our first love. But all through this, the development of the virtues was consistent. The way it was defined by different people in different ages. That's why we turn to God's Word, because it never changes. It remains the same. So we have these personal virtues, and sometimes we emphasize those more in our world, in our worldly development, than the theological virtues. And that is justice, wisdom, or what we sometimes call prudence, being wise, courage, fortitude, moderation, self-control, temperance. Those ideas were there in the cardinal virtues all through the philosophical ages. We see Aristotle practicing moderation, Socrates and Plato practicing wisdom and prudence. The idea of democracy growing in justice. We see the courage of the warrior, the Romans, and others that are taking this idea of courage as fortitude to strengthen oneself as the warrior god. And so these virtues, these cardinal virtues, are good if they're practiced out of a sense of Christian ethics. But when they turn into humanistic ethics, they don't solve all the problems. So again, if we back up to Plato, he believed that our soul could be a rational, harmonious soul if we just had these four virtues: courage, reason, temperance, and justice. These were the sense of having a well-balanced life, a rational, pieces all fitting together. And so he says that these will conquer some of the evils of the desires, the appetites. And so we would have the courage and the reasoning to overcome those senses, desires, with the spirit of courage and wisdom. And that would create a strong soul, or what he calls the psyche. So as we develop those virtues through the Platonic age, Aristotle emphasizes the ethics of the warrior and the rational being. And so Augustine and Anselm also are developing those, and Aquinas during the Middle Ages. And then the great turnaround comes with the advent of Christianity and the biblical virtues. So these medieval ethics developed, always trying to go back to the Greeks as the rational basis, the foundational basis for our soul. And so all of these philosophers were developing this idea of, we can unite Christianity and philosophy. We can put them together and have a stronger existence in this world. So for Aristotle, his virtues would lead us to a rational, good life. We would have the right amount of health, wealth, friendship, happiness, the complete life. But we only know that it's a complete life when we have completed it. And that is, we are moving into actualization. And so we would live in harmony with society in an ethical world with order and discipline. The Christian virtues, again, gave us much more of a specific guideline: hope, kindness, faith, charity, patience, endurance. But again, as Paul tells us, the greatest of these is love. All these are held together by the gift of God, the agape gift of love. So we always say that the theological virtues are this trinity of faith, hope, and love, and that even in the contemporary philosophy, when Kierkegaard says, well, it all depends on our growth, our leap of faith that we have to take. We're not virtuous by revelation. We have to take a leap of faith. That is, we go through periods of time or phases in which we go through what he calls the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. The aesthetic is when we deal with our senses and these natural carnal values. The ethical is when we become more moral and start turning toward the virtues of moderation. But the religious is when we take the leap of faith. That is, we have to really become more religious. But for Kierkegaard, it was a choice, a free will choice of living as if Christ exists, living like Christ. And so he never emphasized the sense of the objectivity of these theological virtues. They were purely subjective choices of free will by the individual. So I tell people to disregard Kierkegaard. Well, faith then is I think the root of the theological virtues. And I like this anagram, FAITH, forwarding all issues to heaven. And so we have the object of faith, who is God. You see, faith is not just a human quality. It has an object of its faith, and that is trying to please and honor God. Faith seeks understanding. It helps us to guide our lives. And so we have this scholastic argument that was developed in the Middle Ages of uniting faith and reasoning. Well, the Bible tells us to do that, to love your Lord with all your heart, mind, and the power of your will and soul. And so hope gives us the best sense of what a Christian is cherishing. That is, it's not just based on opinion and a wish, but on the faith of real belief. It is a certain hope. And so the Bible gives us a certain hope in the resurrection. And so Marcel, the philosopher who says, hope with all of your being is God's will in your being and will. And then C.S. Lewis finally says it's all wrapped up in agape. It's all wrapped up in what he calls the four loves. Phileo is this idea of brotherhood, friendship, philosophical wisdom, but sharing ideas with the other. But that grows into a caring for the other, or sorga, and then eros, a real sense of conquering our appetites, our sensations, and bringing them to the Lord for unconditional love with agape, which envelopes all the different types of love that we have. And so, if God is love and we have our virtue out of love, then we will be more conformed to his image through Christ Jesus.